Hey friends, it's Justin Adkins, and I'm so excited to be sharing with you some new magical inspiration with the latest release from Missing Stamps. For today's card, I am going to be mainly pulling in the magical newspaper stamp set, the EIEIO frame die, the floor stencil, and the Slugs and Kisses stamp set. To begin my card, I'm going to take out the smallest stitched rectangle from the EIEIO die set, and I'm going to die cut out the rectangle shape from some Bristol Smooth Blending cardstock. So I'm going to tack it down with a little bit of tape, and I will go ahead and die cut it off camera. Once everything is all situated, I have my rectangle all put in place on my glass mat. I am going to take some tape and mask off the area that I want to be the floor so that just the floor is revealed and that I have some space to blend comfortably. I do get a little generous when it comes to ink blending, so I'm going to use 2 pieces of tape just to mask off an additional area to protect it from ink. I'm going to use some brushed corduroy distress oxide ink, use my mini foam blending tool, and solidly blend the whole exposed area on the bottom of the panel to get that nice brushed corduroy color. Once I'm satisfied with the amount of ink, I'm going to put my brushed corduroy ink away and then pull out a second color, and I am going to pull out some ground espresso. Using a new foam blending tool, I'm going to add some ground espresso distress oxide ink to the bottom portion of where the brushed corduroy is blended. Then I'm going to pull back in that brushed corduroy blending tool to smooth the blend and make it look more seamless. Using the perspective floor stencil, I am going to use the rectangular tile portion to blend out the floor for this section. I'm going to secure it with some magnets, and then I'm going to use a blending brush with Vintage Photo Distress ink over the stencil. This is distress ink, not oxide ink. The Vintage Photo is going to have a more vibrant, saturated look to it, so I thought it would look really nicely on top of the oxide inks that we've already blended. Once I'm satisfied with the amount of ink that we've put over the stencil, I'm going to remove the stencil and then remove the tape as well. So you're going to see that the floor section was masked off pretty well with the mint tape that we used for our card. Now, reusing that mint tape, I am going to cover up the floor so that the top portion of the card is exposed. We're going to start by using a foam blending tool with some Lumberjack Plaid Distress Oxide ink, and I am going to put it in the center of the card, trying to be as careful as I can to not accidentally pull up some of that tape. As you can see, I did it a little bit, but it ends up not affecting the final project at all. Next, I'm going to pull in some Aged Mahogany Distress Oxide ink, which blends really nicely into the Lumberjack Plaid color. It does add a nice earthiness and begins to mute down the color a little bit more to prepare it for the third color in our blend, which is Ground Espresso. So we're going to make the top of this card portion that Ground Espresso dark brown color. It's also going to call back to the Ground Espresso that we had laid down on the bottom edge of the floor as well, tying all of our colors nicely together. So I am going to blend all of the panel so everything is covered in ink, and then I'm going to repeat my blending tools so that I can work on getting these blends nicely blended into each other. So I'm using the Aged Mahogany to make sure that the transition between Ground Espresso and Aged Mahogany is nice and seamless, and then I'll pull in the Lumberjack Plaid tool to make sure that Lumberjack Plaid color is blended nicely into the Aged Mahogany color, and that's what I like to get for my seamless blends. Using my distress spray tool, I am going to flick some water onto my panel, and I am going to get some really nice bleach marks on there that are going to add a little bit of distress and detail to our background. Now, of course, getting those seamless blends take a lot of practice, so if you're not 100% confident in the blend that you're getting, I love using splatters on top of your background to sort of distract from any sort of imperfect blends. So we're going to use some white opaque paper splatter. This is by Picket Fence Studios. I am going to pull it up with a clean watercolor brush, and I am going to splatter it onto my project so that I get some really nice detail specks on that background. Using my splatter box and some pixie spray, I am going to spray the sparkle stencil, and this is going to allow it to get a really nice tack as I put it on top of my background. With my stencil nicely in place, I am going to pull in some Golden Hour Solar Paste and apply it directly over my stencil. Usually I like to pull in some sort of a scraping tool to get a nice even blend, but because the sparkle bits are so small, I am just going to use a tool just to quickly smooth it over and get a nice application of our Golden Hour Solar Paste. Once I'm satisfied with the amount of paste, I am going to remove my stencil from my background, cleaning it off camera immediately, and also setting my panel aside once I remove my tape so that it can dry out entirely. So I'm going to set this off and we'll come back to it later. Now, using a piece of colored cardstock in my stash that's kind of a coral color, I am going to blend the edge with some Lumberjack Plaid Distress Oxide ink, and we are going to build a custom sentiment using this paper. I think that this red is going to tie really nicely into the darker red background we have for our card, but I like that the coralness of the paper is going to give it a little bit of a lightness as well. We are going to spell out the word friend for the bottom, so I'm just laying out all of my letters, trying to get them all nicely lined up, and also taking advantage of that ink blendedness to ensure that it's going to have a nice variance of color once we get it die cut. I am going to take some mint tape to pull up the letters, and then this is going to keep them all nicely in a row and also protect the top of them. I'm going to put it down on the same piece of paper that I used for my background. I take my jar of Astro paste in the frostbite color and apply a little bit directly to my finger, and then from my finger apply it directly onto each of the EIEIO frame die cuts for the letters to spell out friend. I do set this all aside to dry, and then we're going to move on to die cutting a little bit more. I'm using some gold mixed media glitter paper with the second smallest rectangle included in the EIEIO frame die set, and we are going to die cut out this paper using that rectangle off camera. Now the last panel we're working with is I've taken a piece of some tan cardstock from my stash, and using that vintage photo distress ink, I am going to use my blending brush to go ahead and distress the edges of this panel to give it a sort of aged look. And we are going to create a wizard newspaper of sorts using this effect with the magical newspaper stamp set. So I am going to take my stamp, put it on top of the background in my MISTI, close my MISTI door so that we can go ahead and pick up the stamp, and using some scorched timber distress ink, I'm going to apply this ink directly to our stamp and stamp it onto the paper. I didn't want to use black. I thought it would be a little too stark, and I thought that the scorched timberness would give some nice vintage feels to this paper, which was really the vibe that I was going for. So once I'm satisfied with the amount of ink on my stamp, I'm going to press it down, and then when I pull it up, you are going to see that I'm going to have a really nice application of that stamp onto paper, and it creates a nice newspaper effect. I'm then going to take some gold paper splatter from Picket Fence Studios, and we are going to splatter this onto our project, and after that it's just going to really give a really magical effect, pulling in the sort of concept of splatters and sparkles that we've been doing on the card all along. So these are a little bit more subtle because the paper itself kind of has a gold yellow quality to it, so it doesn't pull up right away, but what is going to pull up right away is I'm pulling back in that opaque white paper splatter. We're going to use a clean watercolor brush with that, pick it up, and then splatter onto our background, and that is going to be immediately noticeable. I really like the contrast of the opaque white. I think it gives a lot of character to the panel and just makes it a lot more fun. Once I'm satisfied with the amount of splatters, I wanted to show you a little bit of a closer look with all those splatters on our background, what it's going to look like. So I am going to set it aside to dry, and let's work on some coloring. I did speed up this portion of the video quite a bit just because the coloring process always takes a little bit of time. You can find all of the Copic market combinations for the Slugs and Kisses images that I colored up below, so be sure to utilize them to get a more detailed look at the colors that I used to bring all of these images together. We are going to color up the image of the red-haired boy holding a bucket of slugs, and then we are also going to color up an additional bucket of slugs along with 2 other slugs as well that are going to really help build this scene. I think that it's really fun with these projects to make sure that when you're doing the coloring that you try to capture each of the details. I really wanted to make his hair nice and fiery red, so I came up with a great combination using some different earth tone and yellow orange markers that I adore it. I think it turned out better than I anticipated. This is definitely a color combination that I'm going to want to keep in my stash, and just so that in the future I know I can pull from it and get a really great coloring from it. After finishing up with the hair, I like to move on to the garments next. So I figured it would be a good time to talk about how I like to color up different grays. A lot of people talk about coloring up black or coloring up white, when the truth of the matter is when you're using alcohol markers, you're using gray markers to get those blends. So I am coloring up the cloak and the pants of this student where he's wearing black garments, but because of that, I'm leaning more into coloring up his garments a little bit lighter than that with my gray markers. So my blends actually are going kind of on the light side because it's important to capture the different highlights in the cloak, because even though that you would consider it all black, you want to make sure that some of it is going to be catching the light. On the flip side, if you're going to be coloring up something that's white in color, I always recommend coloring it up slightly darker because you still want to capture those shadows. You don't want the whole area just to be a highlight, and so take that into account as you're coloring up your image. I'm also using some toner gray markers to color up the shoes for the student as well, and they're going to be color coordinating with the colors of the cloak. Now, this guy is carrying a bucket of slugs, so we're definitely going to want to color them up and also color up the slugs off to the side as well. I decided to go with a earthy yellow-green blend of markers and to brighten them up in the end with some YG00 just because I wanted them to still have kind of a sliminess to them, and I always think that green is a great color to incorporate when you're thinking of slugs and snails. So I've got my color palette for that all situated, and I am coloring up all the slugs at once as opposed to coloring up each portion of the images. This just means less time for me to have to take caps off of my marker, and I do recommend this if you're stamping out a whole sheet of colors, or of different images to color rather. Color up all the like images at once rather than one image at a time, because I think it does save you a little bit of time in the end, and it also keeps you fresh on the mind exactly how you're coloring it up, and there's not going to be too much variation from image to image. So I'm also making sure to color up the bucket, giving it a little bit of an earthier brown tone. And then don't forget there are straps on those buckets as well. I colored those in with a gray metal tone just because I imagined that they were like metal bands holding the whole bucket together. Now we are reaching the end of our coloring, so please remember you can always go back to start from the beginning and slow down the speed of the image if you'd like to see me to color in more of a real time. I add in some gel pen accents and then die cut my images off camera, and here you can get a better idea how all of the image look while they are cut out. So with the images taken care of, we can now begin the process of building our card and putting all the elements together. I am lining up all of my die cuts that spell out the word friend and picking them up with a piece of mint low tack adhesive. I'm putting a little bit of liquid adhesive on the back of each of the letters, and then once I have enough adhesive on all of them, I am going to keep my hands onto that piece of mint tape and allow that mint tape to allow me to easily put all of the letters at once onto our main ink blended panel for our card. I do have a flat edge scraping tool on my desk, so I use that to hold my letters down and remove my tape. Using a liquid adhesive, I place it on the back of our ink blended panel that has our friend sentiment, and I adhere it directly to that gold glitter piece of paper that we had die cut earlier in the video. Once I'm happy with how that's situated, I put liquid adhesive on the back of my panel, and then I apply it directly to the magical newspaper background that we had created earlier in the video as well, trying to keep it as centered as possible. Once I'm happy with the placement of everything on my card front, I'm taking that same piece of paper that I die cut the friend sentiment from, and I'm going to take the Slugs and Kisses sentiment that's included in the Slugs and Kisses stamp set, put it on to this coral colored paper, pick up the sentiment with my Misty Door, and then go ahead and stamp it out with the Scorched Timber Distress ink that we had used earlier in this video. So I'm going to stamp it out and then also die cut it into a strip, and it says Slugs and Kisses. I also thought that it would be nice if I took my blending brush and blended a little bit of vintage photo distress ink on the edges of each of the sides of the sentiment strip, just to give a little extra distress to the element. Using some foam tape strips, I'm going to apply those directly to the back of my sentiment strip, and then I will place that in the upper left corner of our card because I just think that it's going to work really nicely with that sort of a position with the sentiment of friend underneath, and because our eyes read from right to left, I just figure it's better placed. I am continuing with more foam strips to use for my images. So I'm putting a little bit of foam tape behind our student, which I also adhered the additional bucket of slugs directly behind. And I'm going to be using both of them with that foam tape kind of in the center of the card. I'm going to press it down once I'm happy with the placement. And of course, I'm going to put each of the little slugs on small little squares of foam tape as well and push them into place so they're on the other side of our student. And this sort of fills up the ground space and doesn't make it look like there's too much empty space right where he's standing. Using some liquid adhesive, I'm going to put a couple dots onto my panel, and then I am going to use these dots of adhesive to put a couple sparkle spots on there. They're gold sparkle spots. I thought they would coordinate really nicely with the gold paper that we used, but then in addition, it's also going to coordinate with that thin glitter gold paper frame that we have around our ink blended panel. So once I'm satisfied where all of my sparkle spots are, I'm going to take my card panel, put some liquid adhesive on the back, and then apply it to a prepared A2 card base. So I'm going to nicely put that into place, and then once I'm satisfied with the placement, my card is fully completed. So I think that this card's got a lot of magical aspects to it that make it really pop, and I hope that you picked up a couple tips and tricks along the way for how you can incorporate some different tips into making your cards even more magical. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe and follow me on all socials at Just a Note by Justin. You can also use the links below to shop for the different products that I used in this video, and I appreciate you very much for taking the time to use those links as they do help support me in my crafting. Thank you once again for stopping by, and happy crafting. Goodbye.